The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, folded 3 times inside a plain envelope with a Kansas postmark, and Nora Covington had written her name across the back flap, as though she were already certain the man who received it would know exactly who she was before she ever set foot in the territory. Grant Lockhart had been sitting on the porch of the Millhaven post office when the postmaster handed him the envelope, and he had turned it over in his calloused hands twice before he broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting was precise without being fussy, each letter formed with the kind of careful attention that suggested a woman who thought before she acted, who measured her words the way a surveyor measured land. He had expected something flowery, something calculated to make him feel comfortable, the kind of letter a woman writes when she is trying to sell herself. Instead, what he found on those pages made him sit forward in his chair and read every word twice. She had written that she was 26 years old, that she had spent the last 4 years teaching school in a small town called Rutherford, Kansas, that her father had died of a fever the previous autumn, and that she had no remaining family in that state. She had written that she was not beautiful in the way that word was typically used, but that she was strong and capable and not given to fainting or to complaint. She had written that she was willing to come west, willing to learn what she did not know, willing to work beside a man rather than simply behind him. And then, in the second-to-last paragraph, she had written the line that Grant read 4 times before he folded the letter and pressed it against his knee. She had written that she wanted honesty above all things, that she had received 2 prior offers through the matrimonial correspondence service in Dodge City, and that both men had presented themselves as something they were not, and that she had arrived in one instance to a sod house with a leaking roof and a man who had conveniently forgotten to mention his 3 children from a previous marriage, and in the second instance to a man who had described himself as a rancher, but who was in fact a drifter with a whiskey problem. She had written that she was not a naive woman and she would not be treated as one. She had written that she would rather know the hard truth before she arrived than discover it after she had unpacked her trunk. She had written, very plainly, that if a man could not be honest with her before she even shook his hand, then there was no point in any of it. Grant had sat with that letter for a long time. He was 32 years old, and he had answered the matrimonial advertisement in the Dodge City newspaper, not because he was lonely in the ordinary sense, though he was that, but because the ranch demanded more than one person could manage, and because the winters in the New Mexico territory had a way of making a man understand his own smallness. He had inherited the Lockhart spread from his uncle 3 years prior, 1,000 acres of good grazing land along the Cimarron River, and he had built it into something worth inheriting since then. He was not a dishonest man, but he was a complicated one, and so he did something that none of the men in his acquaintance would have thought to do. He sat down at his kitchen table that same evening with a pot of coffee and a clean sheet of paper, and he wrote Nora Covington back. He thanked her for her directness. He told her it was the most refreshing letter he had received in his adult life. And then, because she had asked for honesty, and he was not a man who did things by half measures, he told her 3 things that he had not told any of the other women who had written to him through the correspondence service, things he had always reasoned he would explain once a woman arrived and could see the whole of him in context, things that were easier to soften when a person was looking at you rather than reading your words cold on a page. He told her first that the ranch was in good shape, but that the house itself was plain and rough, and that any woman who arrived expecting comfort was going to be disappointed for at least the first year while he finished the improvements he had planned. He told her the bedroom had no proper window yet, only a covered opening that let in cold air in the winter, and that the kitchen floor was bare packed earth rather than boards, and that the stove was a good one but the chimney drew poorly and filled the room with smoke when the wind came from the east. He told her second that he had a reputation in Millhaven that she ought to know about before she arrived. 3 years prior, there had been trouble with a neighboring rancher named Holt Deegan, a man who claimed that Grant had pushed him off a water claim that was rightfully his. The dispute had gone to the county court, and Grant had won, because the claim had been legally registered in his uncle's name for 15 years. But Deegan was the kind of man who did not accept legal conclusions quietly, and he had spent the 3 years since that ruling saying things around town that were not true. Grant told her this plainly, that there were people in Millhaven who would say things about him, and that he wanted her to hear his account of it first, and that if she came and asked around and decided he was not the man he was presenting himself to be, he would personally arrange her transportation back to wherever she wished to go. He told her third that he had been engaged once before. Her name had been Clara Marsh, and she had been a local girl, the daughter of the feed store owner in Millhaven, and they had been engaged for 8 months before she had broken it off because she could not bear the isolation of ranch life. He told Nora that he did not speak badly of Clara, that he understood her reasons, but that any woman who was thinking of coming to the Lockhart spread needed to understand clearly what she was agreeing to. The nearest town was 11 miles. The nearest doctor was 23. Neighbors were a half-hour's ride in the best conditions. He told her that the loneliness was real and that a woman ought to know it going in. He sealed the letter and sent it the next morning before he could reconsider it. He did not expect a reply. He was wrong. Her reply came 11 days later, which was about as long as it took a letter to travel from Rutherford, Kansas to Millhaven, New Mexico territory, and a response to make the return journey, assuming the woman who received his letter sat down to write back immediately, which apparently Nora Covington had done. She wrote that the condition of the house did not concern her unduly, because she had been living in a boarding house with 4 other women and a landlady who rationed the firewood. She wrote that she appreciated him telling her about Holt Deegan, and she asked one question about it. Had Grant done anything that he was ashamed of in the course of that dispute, regardless of what the court had decided? She wrote that she had no interest in judging a man by his enemies, only by his own conscience. She wrote that she was sorry about Clara Marsh, and that it was good of him to mention her, and that she understood loneliness, that she had been living with it herself for some time, and that loneliness shared between 2 people who respected each other was a different animal than loneliness endured alone. Then she wrote that she was willing to come. She wrote that she would take the train from Rutherford to Dodge City, and the stage from Dodge City south through the territory, and that she could arrive in approximately 3 weeks if he sent back his agreement by return post. She wrote one final line at the bottom of the page below her signature, as though she had thought of it as an afterthought but had decided it needed to be said. She wrote, "I have been disappointed before and I have recovered from it. I am not fragile, but I am also not without limits. Come to this honestly, Mr. Lockhart, or do not come to it at all." Grant read that final line 3 times, and then he did something he had not done in a long time. He smiled, there alone at his kitchen table with the coffee going cold beside him, and he wrote back his agreement by return post. He also answered her question. He wrote that there was one moment in the dispute with Deegan that he was not proud of, that in the early days of the conflict, when Deegan had begun spreading rumors and Grant had been young and angry enough not to think clearly, he had ridden to Deegan's property line and said things that were threatening and not befitting a man of character. That nothing physical had come of it, and that he had not repeated the behavior, and that he had spent 3 years since then conducting himself in a way he could be easier with. He wrote that he did not think it changed the fundamental rightness of his position in the water claim dispute, but that he had not been his best self in that moment, and she deserved to know it. He sent the letter and spent the next 3 weeks finishing the bedroom window. The stage from Dodge City came through Millhaven on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Grant knew she was coming on a Wednesday in early April, and he had calculated the weeks carefully from her last letter. He drove the wagon into town the morning of that Wednesday and waited outside the stage depot with his hat in his hands, which he realized some time later was a strange affectation because it left his head bare to the April sun. But he had not been able to put it back on his head without feeling like he was doing something wrong. The stage arrived 40 minutes late, which in those days was early. He watched the passengers disembark from the coach, and he did not know her at first, which surprised him because he had been building a picture of her in his mind from her letters. He had imagined a schoolteacher's kind of seriousness, a woman who wore her hair in a tight bun and had ink stains on her fingers and looked at the world over the tops of round spectacles. What he saw instead was a woman in a practical brown traveling dress who stepped down from the coach without waiting for the driver's assistance, set her small trunk down on the depot porch herself, and stood looking around the main street of Millhaven with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite resignation, but something useful between the two. She was not what he had imagined in terms of appearance. Her hair was dark and came loose from its pins in the way that long journeys inflicted on a woman's best efforts. She was not tall, but she was not small either. Her face was not the fashionable kind of pretty that women's magazines showed, but it was a face that struck him as honest, open, like the kind of face that told you exactly what it was thinking whether it meant to or not. And she was looking at the town of Millhaven with an assessment that missed nothing, her eyes moving along the storefronts and the dusty street with the same careful attention her handwriting had suggested. He walked toward her. She saw him coming and turned to face him fully, and they looked at each other across the distance of about 10 paces, and then he stopped walking and said, without fully meaning to lead with this but finding it was what came out of his mouth, "The chimney still draws badly from the east. I tried to fix it last week and I made it worse." She looked at him, a long, measuring look. Then something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile but close, and she said, "Then we will figure out the chimney." He put out his hand, she shook it. That was how it began. They drove the 11 miles from Millhaven to the Lockhart spread mostly in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence, but the particular kind of quiet that settles between two people who have said so much in letters that they are taking time to reconcile the words with the actual physical presence of each other. The April air was still cool and smelled of sage, and the particular mineral sharpness that came off the desert after a night's rain. The land opened up around them as they left town, the flat stretching away into distance in every direction, the sky enormous overhead in the way that always startled people who had come from the east, that particular quality of western sky that seemed to begin at your feet rather than above your head. Nora sat on the wagon seat beside him and looked out at all of it, and she did not say it was overwhelming or frightening or more than she had expected. She said, "The sky here is a different color than in Kansas." He looked up at it. "How so?" "Kansas sky is blue," she said. "This is something else, more like the inside of a shell." He thought about that. "I never had a word for it," he said. "I teach reading," she said. "I spend a lot of time looking for words." "You taught," he corrected gently. "You don't have a school here, not yet." She turned and looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "Not yet," she agreed. "But there are children out here, aren't there? I saw 3 of them on the main street." "There are children, families scattered across the basin. The county has been trying to establish a school for 2 years, but there's no one to run it." "Then there will be a school," she said, and turned back to look at the road ahead with the same settled certainty with which she had said they would figure out the chimney. He felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for either. The ranch house was everything he had described and nothing worse, which was the best thing he could say about it. It was a solid adobe and timber construction, 1 story, 3 rooms, with a covered porch along the front that faced west toward the mountains. The barn was in better shape than the house, which was the typical condition of working ranches, because the livestock's shelter directly affected a man's livelihood in a way that the quality of his own kitchen floor did not. There were 4 ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse 30 yards from the main house, good men, quiet and capable, and they had made themselves conspicuously absent when Grant's wagon pulled into the yard, which was a courtesy he had asked of them. Nora walked through the 3 rooms of the house with the same thorough attention she had given the main street of Millhaven. She looked at the kitchen, at the stove, at the bare earth floor. She looked at the main room with its fireplace, and its 2 mismatched chairs and its rough table. She looked at the bedroom, at the new window that Grant had installed, the one with actual glass that he had ordered from the hardware store in Millhaven and put in himself with considerable effort and several broken panes before he got it right. She stood in the bedroom for a moment and then turned to look at him, and he was standing in the doorway with his hat actually on his head this time, watching her. "You put the window in," she said. "Yes." "After you got my letter saying I'd come?" "Yes." She looked at the window and then back at him. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that was not about the window alone, and he knew it. They were married by the Justice of the Peace in Millhaven 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon in April of 1882. It was not a grand ceremony. There were 4 witnesses, the postmaster, the woman who ran the dry goods store, and 2 of Grant's ranch hands who had put on clean shirts for the occasion. Nora wore her second-best dress, which was a dark blue wool that was more suited to a Kansas winter than a New Mexico spring, but was the nicest thing she had brought. Grant wore his good coat and his least battered hat. The Justice of the Peace was a man named Hiram Fell, who had been performing marriages in Millhaven for 11 years, and had developed the particular practiced warmth of a man who understood that brevity was a kindness. When it was done and they stepped out onto the porch of the justice's office into the afternoon sun, Nora stood beside Grant and they both looked at the street, and there was a moment, a long, quiet, suspended moment, in which the enormity of what they had done sat between them like a third person. Then Grant said, "There's a decent restaurant on the far end of Main Street. I thought we might eat a proper meal before we drive back." Nora said, "I would like that very much." They ate at a table by the window of the Golden Hoof restaurant, which served beef and beans and fresh bread, and an apple pie that Nora declared was the best she had eaten since leaving Kansas, and Grant watched her eat it with unself-conscious enjoyment, and thought that this was a woman who was going to be all right, more than all right. He thought it the way a man thinks something when he is not ready to think the fuller version of it yet, the way you know a storm is coming before you have admitted to yourself that you need to get the horses in. The first weeks were not easy, but they were not dishonest either, and that made all the difference. They were 2 strangers learning to share a small space, and there were moments of awkwardness, of saying the wrong thing or inadvertently crossing into the other person's way of doing a thing, of the particular friction that happens when 2 fully formed adults have to renegotiate every domestic habit they have spent decades establishing. Nora had a way of organizing things that was different from Grant's way, which was largely to put things down wherever his hands happened to be at the moment and rely on his memory to find them again. She said nothing about this for the first week, and then one morning he could not find his good sheathing knife, the one he used for the leather work on the harnesses, and she produced it from a tin on the shelf beside the door where she had placed it with a collection of other tools that lived in the kitchen, and he said, "I've been looking for that," and she said, "I can put it back where it was," and he said, "No, here is sensible. I just need to know where sensible is." She had looked at him as though she was filing that information away carefully. He had a temper that he was generally in control of, but that showed itself occasionally in the form of a very particular silence, a compressed quality to the air around him when something went wrong that was neither pleasant nor frightening, but simply present. She learned to recognize it within the first 2 weeks, and her response to it was not to back away, but to ask him directly what the matter was, which consistently derailed whatever quiet storm was building, because he found it almost impossible to maintain a contained anger when someone was looking at him calmly and asking him to explain it. She wrote letters to the county education board in Santa Fe about establishing a school in the basin. She wrote the first letter 2 weeks after her arrival, and she had a response within a month, which in that time and in that territory was remarkable, and suggested that the county education board had been wanting to deal with this problem for some time, and had simply been waiting for someone to take the first step. The response said that if she could secure a building and could demonstrate 10 or more students of school age in the basin, the county would provide a teacher's salary and basic supplies. She told Grant about this over supper one evening, reading him the relevant parts of the letter, and he listened and then said, "There's the old Macy homestead about 3 miles east. They moved on 2 years ago and the building is still standing. Good solid adobe. I could look into who holds the title. You would do that. You're trying to build a school. That's worth doing." She looked at him across the supper table with an expression that was learning very slowly to show what was underneath it rather than what was careful and measured on top. "Why do you do that?" she asked. "Do what?" "Say something kind and then present it as though it's simply practical." He thought about that. "I suppose I don't know how to say kind things without covering them in practicality. It feels less exposed." She was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the kindness," she said. "Even through the practicality." He nodded. He looked down at his plate. He said very quietly, "I appreciate you noticing it." The old Macy homestead was still in reasonably good condition, as Grant had thought, and the title had been returned to the county when the Macy family had defaulted on their land fees. Grant spoke to the county land office in Millhaven and arranged for the building to be designated as a school-use property, which cost him an afternoon's worth of conversation and a formal written request and a fee of $3, which he paid without mentioning to Nora until she found the receipt and asked about it. "That was my cause," she said. "I should have paid that." "You don't have money of your own yet," he said. "You will once the salary starts, but right now you don't." "That doesn't sit right with me," she said. "I know," he said, "but it's a practical truth. When you have money, you can pay for the next practical thing." She pressed her lips together in a way that said she was accepting an argument without necessarily agreeing with it, which was a face he was learning to read. "Fine," she said, "but I am keeping an accounting." "I expected nothing less," he said. She went around the basin on horseback, which she had learned to ride well enough in Kansas, and she knocked on the door of every family homestead within a reasonable distance of the old Macy building. She counted 14 children of school age, which was 4 more than she needed. She wrote to Santa Fe with this information, and within 6 weeks had a formal letter of appointment as the teacher of the Cimarron Basin School, with a salary of $22 a month, which was not lavish but was not nothing. Grant watched her become, in the space of those 6 weeks, someone who was even more fully herself than the woman who had stepped off the stage in Millhaven, and he had not thought she was lacking in fullness then. She had a sense of purpose now, a mission beyond the domestic work of the ranch house, and it animated her in a way that made the already interesting matter of watching her go about the world even more interesting to him. He also noticed, somewhere in this same period, that he had begun looking for reasons to be near her when she was in the house, that he had developed the habit of coming in for his midday meal rather than eating in the field as he had done for the previous 3 years, because the meal she prepared and the conversation that accompanied it were the best part of his day. That he sat on the porch in the evenings longer than he needed to, not because the evening air required him, but because she sat there too, reading or writing or simply looking at the mountains, and the quality of the silence in her presence was different from all other silences. He did not say any of this to her directly. He was not yet certain how. What he did instead in early June was fix the chimney properly. He studied the problem for 2 full days, climbed onto the roof 3 times, and consulted with a man in Millhaven who had built 3 fireplaces and knew something about draw and airflow and the particular way a flue should be angled to work correctly in desert wind conditions. He rebuilt the top section of the chimney with different angled stones and mortared the gaps, and then waited for an east wind. The east wind came on a Thursday morning, and he built a fire in the kitchen stove and stood in the kitchen doorway watching the smoke. It went up and out as it was supposed to. No smoke filled the room. Nora came in from the water pump, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped when she saw him standing in the doorway with an expression of concentrated satisfaction on his face. "What happened?" she asked. "Look," he said, gesturing at the stove. She looked. She watched the clean, thin curl of smoke rising from the stovepipe without any of its usual lateral drift into the room. She walked over and put her hand near the stovepipe and felt the heat drawing properly upward. She turned around and looked at him. And then she walked directly across the kitchen and put her arms around him, which was the first time she had done anything of that nature since the brief businesslike moment after their wedding, when the justice of the peace had indicated that the groom might kiss the bride, and Grant had kissed her on the cheek so quickly that it barely counted. He stood very still for a moment, because his hands did not immediately know what to do, and then he put his arms around her and held her, and the solid warmth of another person holding him was so unexpectedly moving that he had to work to keep his expression composed when she finally stepped back. "The chimney drew you out of yourself," she said, looking at him. "I beg your pardon. You look," she said carefully, "like a person who just discovered he was allowed to be happy." He did not have an answer to that which was answer enough, and she seemed to know it. It was not long after the chimney that Holt Deegan made his presence known again, which was, Grant reflected later, the kind of timing the universe produced when it wanted to remind a man that contentment was not a permanent condition, but a territory requiring active defense. Deegan was a big man, broad through the chest, with a mean quality to his face that had nothing to do with any particular expression he was making, but was simply the natural resting state of his features. He rode onto Lockhart land on a Saturday morning in late June with two of his hired men behind him, and Grant was in the near paddock working with a young horse when he heard the hoofbeats and looked up. He went out to the fence and waited. Deegan pulled up and looked down at him from the saddle with the kind of deliberate height advantage that men like Deegan cultivated. "Lockhart," he said, "heard you got married." "That's right," Grant said. "May lord or woman?" "She came through the correspondence service, yes," Grant said, keeping his voice even. "Is there something you need from me, Deegan, or did you ride 11 miles to discuss my domestic arrangements?" Deegan looked past him toward the ranch house. "Just wanted to introduce myself to your new wife," he said, being neighborly. "I'll pass that along," Grant said. "You can turn around now." Deegan's expression tightened. The two men behind him shifted in their saddles. "You still think you own that water claim, Lockhart?" "The county court thinks I own that water claim," Grant said, "which amounts to the same thing. Courts can be wrong. When they are, there's an appeals process." "You tried it 3 years ago." Deegan looked at him for a long moment and then looked again at the ranch house, and there was something in that look that Grant did not like, a calculation that was not about him but about something else, and he said, "I'll thank you to point your eyes somewhere else." Deegan smiled, which was worse than his neutral expression, and turned his horse around. Grant watched them ride away and then went directly to the house. Nora was at the kitchen table with a stack of papers she was preparing for the school which was opening the following month, and she looked up when he came in with that particular alertness she had developed for reading the atmosphere he carried in with him. "Deegan was just here," he said. "The man from the water dispute." "Yes. What did he want?" "I'm not certain yet. He said he was being neighborly, which is not in his character." Grant poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. "I want you to know about it because you deserve to know about it. And I want to ask you not to ride out alone toward the eastern section of the property for the next little while where his boundary meets ours." Nora set down her pen. "Is he dangerous?" "He's the kind of man who believes he's been wronged and has spent 3 years nursing that belief," Grant said. "That can make a man unpredictable." "All right," she said. "I'll be careful." She paused. "Should we tell the sheriff?" "Teller is the county sheriff." "I'll ride in Monday and have a conversation with him, let him know Deegan was here." "That's sensible," she said, and then, "Are you all right?" He looked at her. "Men like Deegan are a fact of this territory. I've handled him before." "I didn't ask if you'd handled him before," she said. "I asked if you were all right." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment, at her practical, direct face and her ink-stained fingers and the pile of school papers in front of her, at this woman who had come 1,100 miles on a stranger's word, and was now sitting at his kitchen table asking him how he felt rather than whether the situation was manageable. "No," he said. "Not entirely. I don't like that he came here and looked at the house the way he did. I don't like the implication of it." "The implication," she said carefully, "that there is now something here more important to you than there was before." He met her eyes and held them. "Yes," he said, "that is the implication." Something passed between them in that moment, something that had been building since the stage depot in April, and the chimney that drew and the moment she had put her arms around him. And it was not yet the thing it was going to be, but it was close enough to it that they both felt it and neither of them looked away. Grant rode in to see Sheriff Teller on Monday, as he had said he would. Teller was a man in his 50s, deliberate and fair, who had been the county sheriff since before Grant had inherited the Lockhart ranch. He listened to what Grant told him with the patient attention of a man who had heard a great many complaints about Holt Deegan over the past decade. "He hasn't done anything I can act on," Teller said when Grant had finished. "Riding onto a man's property and having a conversation is not a crime, but I'll ride out and have my own conversation with him this week, let him know that the county is aware of his movements." "I appreciate that," Grant said. "Your wife's settling in well?" Teller asked, because that was the kind of conversation Millhaven had in 1882, where everyone knew everyone's business and the asking of it was considered courtesy rather than intrusion. "She's opening a school," Grant said. Teller raised his eyebrows. "Is that right? Next month, the old Macy building." Teller leaned back in his chair and looked at Grant with an expression that was assessment and approval at the same time. "You picked a good one," he said. Grant thought about that on the drive back to the ranch, the 11 miles of sage and space and the mountains in the west going gold in the afternoon light. He thought about what Teller had said and about what it meant that he agreed with it, that he had been agreeing with some version of it since the first week of their marriage and was only now finding the language for it. He picked a good one. She had picked a good one too, or he intended to make sure she could say that without qualification. He was thinking about this when he drove the wagon back into the yard and saw the kitchen lamplight through the new window he had put in, warm and steady against the deepening evening, and felt the particular quality of gladness that is different from ordinary happiness because it is about a specific person and a specific place and the fact of their combination. He thought, "I am going to have to tell her." He did not tell her that night, because when he came in, she was reading aloud to herself from a textbook she was reviewing for the school curriculum, murmuring the words of a passage about arithmetic in a low, concentrated voice, and she looked up and said, "There's stew on the stove," with such total matter-of-factness that the moment for telling her seemed to require a different setting than this one. He was, when it came to the ranch and to practical problems and to difficult men like Holt Deegan, a direct and confident person. He was, when it came to the particular problem of explaining to someone that you had begun to love them, considerably less so. The school opened on the first Monday of July, 1882, in the old Macy building that had been swept out and aired and furnished with 8 wooden benches, and a writing board that Grant and 2 of his ranch hands had hauled out there in the wagon. 12 children arrived on the first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 14, accompanied by their parents or older siblings, and the parents stood outside for a while in the morning sun and spoke to each other in the way that people who are scattered across a large landscape speak when they come together, with the concentrated energy of people who have been apart for a while. Grant stood outside with them, having driven Nora out in the wagon and stayed because there was no reason not to, and he watched her through the window of the schoolhouse, arranging the children and the benches, and moving through the room with an ease that told him she had been doing this for years, that this was not a person uncertain of her function. She had a way with children that was neither saccharine nor stern, but something in between, warm but expecting, and he could see it working on the 12 unfamiliar children in front of her, the way they settled into it like they had always been there. One of the fathers standing near him, a man named Pete Calloway who ran a small cattle operation about 8 miles northeast, said, "She seems like she knows what she's doing." "She does," Grant said. Calloway looked at him with the sideways look of a man making an assessment. "Good woman is a different kind of good land," he said. "More value in her than you can calculate when you first put eyes on the property." Grant considered whether this analogy was entirely respectful and decided that Calloway meant it well and that its fundamental truth outweighed its imperfection. "Yes," he said, "I'm beginning to understand that." The summer heat settled onto the basin in that particular way of the New Mexico territory, where the days became enormous and white with it, but the evenings were still, clear, and sometimes impossibly beautiful. The sky going through shades of orange and pink and deep violet that seemed too operatic to be real, until you had lived there long enough to accept them as ordinary. Nora and Grant fell into the rhythm of their shared life with the particular efficiency of two people who were both, at bottom, practical people, and they found within that rhythm something that neither of them had predicted, a genuine ease with each other, a comfort that was not the absence of feeling but a very full presence of it, like the difference between an empty room and a room that has been well lived in. She learned the ranch in the way she learned everything, systematically and with attention. She went out with him on the weekend mornings, when school was not in session, and asked questions about the cattle and the grazing rotation and the water management that he answered with increasing pleasure because they were good questions, the kind of questions that showed she was thinking about it seriously and not just asking to be polite. She was not trying to do his job. She was trying to understand his world. In return, he came out to the schoolhouse one afternoon and sat at the back on one of the children's benches, which was too small for him, and made his knees project at an uncomfortable angle and watched her teach. She taught a lesson about geography and the history of the Western Territories, using a map she had drawn herself on a large sheet of brown paper and pinned to the wall, and she taught it with a passion that was almost physical, moving across the front of the room, pointing at the map, asking the children questions, and listening to their answers with full attention. He sat at the back on his too small bench and watched her, and he thought, "This woman is remarkable, and I am the only person in this territory who knows the full extent of it." He drove her home that afternoon in the wagon, and the evening was doing its usual extravagance of color in the west, and he said, without having planned to say it, "I want to tell you something." She turned from looking at the sunset and looked at him. "I have been in difficulty," he said, "trying to find a way to say this without it coming out either more sentimental than I mean or less than I mean. So I am going to say it plainly, which is how we started." "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I don't mean in the way of a man who has been alone too long and is grateful for company, though I was alone and I am grateful for company. I mean specifically with you. With the person you are. With the way you approached a difficult situation honestly and didn't pretend it was anything other than what it was, and with the way you fixed a place you'd never seen before as though it already belonged to you, and with the way you look at my land and ask good questions about it, and with the way you teach those children in a way that makes them want to know things." He paused. "I know we have only known each other 4 months. I know that is not very long. But I have spent 4 months paying very close attention, and I am confident in what I am telling you." She was quiet for a long moment. The wagon moved along the track through the sage, and the horses' hooves were soft in the dust, and the mountains ahead were turning the color of embers. "When I wrote that letter," she said finally, "the one to the correspondence service, when I wrote the part about honesty, I wrote it because I was tired of being careful. I had been careful for years, choosing what to say and what to hold back, measuring how much of myself to show, because if you show too much and it is not wanted, you have nowhere to retreat to." She looked at her hands in her lap. "And then you wrote back and told me 3 things that were true and that you could have easily not told me. And I thought, this is a man who has decided that truth is worth the risk of it." "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking the same thing as you," she said. "For most of the same 4 months." She looked at him. "I am also in love with you, and I want you to know that I am entirely certain of it, because I am not a person who says things she is not certain of." He pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the track because the horses didn't need his guidance for this last stretch, and he wanted to look at her without also managing a team. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sky behind her was doing something extraordinary. He said, "May I kiss you, properly this time?" She said, "Yes. I was wondering when you were going to get around to it." He kissed her there in the stopped wagon on the track through the sage, with the mountains going gold in the evening, and it was nothing like the brief formality on the justice of the peace's porch. It was the kind of kiss that has all 4 months of careful observation and genuine feeling behind it. And when they separated, they were both slightly breathless, not from the exertion of it, but from the release of all the contained feeling that had been waiting to be expressed that way. She put her head on his shoulder, which was not a thing she had done before, and he put his arm around her, which was not a thing he had done before, and they sat that way in the stopped wagon while the light changed around them. "We should get the horses home," she said eventually. "Yes," he agreed, and picked up the reins and drove them home through the last of the evening light. What happened next in their lives was not a single dramatic thing, but an accumulation of ordinary things that together made up the fabric of a genuine shared life, which is the way love actually works in real places among real people, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the continuous daily practice of choosing each other. Grant hired a second ranch hand named Samuel Torres, a young man of 20 who had grown up on a ranching family's land south of Santa Fe, and who knew cattle work and horses, and not much else, but knew those things very well. Samuel had a gentle disposition and a quick practical mind, and within a month had become something like a younger brother to the ranch's rhythm. Nora taught his younger sister Rosa, who was 11, at the school, and the Torres family became the first of several families in the basin who moved from being distant neighbors to something closer to friends. Holt Deegan, following Sheriff Teller's visit to his property, had subsided into a sullen absence. Teller told Grant in August that Deegan had been having financial trouble, that his ranch was not as profitable as Deegan had claimed, and that a dry spring had hurt his cattle numbers. Grant felt no satisfaction at this. He had not wanted Deegan's ruin, only his non-interference. He said so to Nora, and she said, "That's a generous way to feel about a man who frightened you." "He didn't frighten me," Grant said, and then stopped, because that was not entirely honest, and honesty was what they had built everything on. "He frightened me on your behalf," he said, "which is different from being frightened for myself, but is still a kind of being frightened." She looked at him with that expression she had, the one that showed everything she was thinking whether she meant it to or not. "I know," she said. "I was frightened on your behalf too." By September, they had cleared the kitchen floor and laid proper boards, because Grant had ordered the timber and spent 3 weekends doing the work himself, with Nora handing him tools and arguing companionably about the best way to fit the planks at the corners, which she had definite opinions about despite having no experience with carpentry. The finished floor was not perfect, but it was solid and level and a great improvement, and Nora celebrated its completion by baking a pie, apple from the dried fruit she had put up in August, and they ate it at the kitchen table on the new floor, and Grant told her it was the best apple pie he had ever eaten, which was true. "You said the same thing about the pie at the Golden Hoof on our wedding day," she said. "I was wrong then," he said. "This one is better." She laughed, which was a sound he had come to specifically look forward to, and the evening was warm and the lamplight was steady, and the chimney drew perfectly, and the floor was solid under their chairs. And Grant sat across the table from his wife and thought that this was a life worth the trouble of building. In October, Nora told him that she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him in the morning, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most important things, without preamble or performance. She was standing at the stove and she said, "I think I am pregnant. I'm not certain yet, but I think so." Grant was at the table with his coffee and he put the cup down and stood up and crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him with an expression that was measuring, gauging his reaction, the way she did when she was not certain what the response was going to be. He put his hands on her face very gently and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling fine," she said. "A bit tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine." "Good," he said. And then, because he could not contain it any further, "Good, that is very good." And he kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his hands and held them there. And they stood in the kitchen in the morning light for a long moment before she said, "The oatmeal is going to burn." And he stepped back and let her attend to it with a smile on his face that stayed there the entire day. The pregnancy confirmed itself over the following weeks with the various signs that such things confirmed themselves in 1882, and Nora made an appointment to be examined by the doctor in Millhaven, who was a methodical man named Dr. Emmett Price. And Dr. Price confirmed what she suspected and told her the baby would likely arrive in late spring or early summer of 1883. She continued teaching school through the winter, which was a mild one by the territory standards, and Grant drove her out to the schoolhouse on the cold mornings and picked her up in the afternoons, which added time to his days but which he organized without complaint. And when she pointed out that she was capable of driving herself, he said, "I know you are. I like the drive." She looked at him sideways and let it go. The winter evenings were long, and they filled them with the particular intimacy of shared domestic life, reading and talking, and the occasional game of cards. And the conversations they had ranged across everything: the ranch and the school and the territory's political situation, and the books they were both reading, and the memories of their earlier lives before they had found each other. He learned about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself, who had raised her alone after her mother died when Nora was 8, who had given her a love of books and a practical intelligence, and a somewhat inflexible insistence on honesty that she identified with a wry smile as clearly the origin of her letter-writing philosophy. She learned about his uncle, the original Lockhart, who had come to the territory in 1859 and built the first version of the ranch house, and held onto the land through the Civil War years and the Apache conflicts, and the long cattle drives that had shaped the landscape and the economy of the territory. She learned that Grant had come west from Missouri at 19, following his uncle because there was nothing holding him east, and that he had spent 13 years becoming the kind of man who could hold 1,000 acres and be worth the holding of them. "Were you happy here before I came?" she asked him once in a February evening with a fire burning and snow on the ground outside, unusual weather for the territory. He thought about it seriously. "I was productive," he said. "I was building something worth building, but no, I was not happy in the way I am happy now. I had made peace with the solitude, which is not the same thing." She looked at the fire. "I was not happy in Kansas," she said. "I thought I was. I thought that teaching school and living quietly was enough and that wanting more than that was a kind of greediness." She paused. "I was wrong about that." "What changed your mind?" "The first man from the correspondence service," she said. "When I arrived and found the leaking roof and the 3 children and the man who had lied to me, I was not devastated by the lie. I was angry. And the anger told me something about what I actually wanted, which was not just a situation to manage but a life to share with a person I could genuinely respect and be respected by." She looked at him. "I had been managing situations for years. I wanted something better than that." "And did you find it?" he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I found something considerably better than that." He reached across and took her hand, which was a thing they did now without the self-consciousness that had attended the first months, and they sat together by the fire while the snow fell quietly outside and the ranch was still and the territory was enormous and cold around them, and they were warm. The spring came back to the basin, the way it always did, with the smell of sage after rain, and the particular quality of morning light that made the mountains look close enough to touch. And Nora's pregnancy advanced through April and into May with the straightforward biological efficiency that Dr. Price had assured them was entirely healthy. She had stopped teaching school at the end of April, as much for the sake of the children's calm as for her own, because there is a limit to how well 12 children between the ages of 6 and 14 can concentrate on geography and arithmetic when their teacher is visibly in the later stages of expecting a child, and they are all deeply curious about it. She had arranged for the school to be closed for the remainder of the term and reopened in the fall. She spent the weeks before the baby came in the way. She spent most things usefully. She repaired and organized and planned, and she wrote letters to the county education board about the school's second year, and she put up preserves from the early garden, and she drove Grant slightly to distraction by attempting to move a heavy bookcase from one wall of the main room to another by herself on a Wednesday morning when he was out in the east pasture. He came in at noon and found her sitting in the only chair that was not blocked by the half-moved bookcase, looking flushed and somewhat irritated with herself. "You were going to move the bookcase," he said. "I was moving the bookcase," she said. "You shouldn't be moving bookcases in your condition." "I am fully aware of that now," she said, in a tone that told him not to elaborate on the point. He moved the bookcase to where she had wanted it. He did not say anything further about it. She said, "Thank you," in a voice that also said thank you for not saying anything further about it, and he went back out to the east pasture with the comfortable knowledge that they were getting very good at this. Their son was born on the 15th of June, 1883, a little after 10 in the morning, in the bedroom of the Lockhart Ranch house with Dr. Price in attendance and a woman named Helen Torres, Samuel's mother, who had delivered 7 children of her own and was present as a practical matter of assistance. Grant was in the house, and it was the longest morning of his life. He was not permitted in the bedroom, which was the custom of the time, and he sat in the main room and heard things that he dealt with by walking repeatedly from the fireplace to the kitchen door and back again, until Helen Torres came out and told him he had a son. He stood very still. "Nora," he said. "Perfectly fine," Helen Torres said. "Strong woman, your wife, go see them." He went in. Nora was in the bed with the look of a person who has accomplished something enormous and knows it, tired and clear-eyed at the same time, and she was holding the baby, which was a small red creature with no opinion yet about anything but a very definite opinion about breathing, which it was doing with great energy. Grant sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby and then looked at Nora. "Hello," he said, which was not a sophisticated thing to say but was what came out. "Hello," she said. "Come and look at him properly." He looked at the baby properly. The baby looked, insofar as a newborn has opinions about the looking, back at him. "Looks like he's thinking hard about something," Grant said. "He just arrived in the world," Nora said. "Everything is very new." Grant put his hand very carefully against the baby's head, which was very small under his hand, and felt the warmth of him and the extraordinary fragility of him, and found that his chest had done something he had not predicted. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I thought, if you agreed, Thomas, after my father." "Thomas Lockhart," he said, and the name settled into the room and into the quiet morning and felt right. "Yes, I agree." Thomas Lockhart proved to be a child of good disposition and considerable determination, which was perhaps predictable given his parentage. He slept with the conviction of a person who believed in sleep, and he ate with the same conviction. He was interested in everything from a very early age, which Grant attributed to having a schoolteacher for a mother, and Nora attributed to having a rancher for a father, and the argument about which of them was responsible for his various excellent qualities, became one of the running friendly arguments of their life together, of which there were a good number. Nora returned to teaching in September as she had planned. Helen Torres, who came to the ranch 2 mornings a week to help with washing, agreed to watch Thomas on those mornings, and Grant's arrangement of picking Nora up in the afternoon continued, now with Thomas asleep in a basket on the wagon seat between them on the return drive. The school had grown to 15 students by the second year, because word had spread further into the basin and 2 families had relocated to within school distance, which was a development Nora found both flattering and practically useful. She had also, through her letter-writing campaign to Santa Fe, secured a donation of 50 new books for the school library, which she arranged on the shelf she had built with Grant's help along the south wall of the schoolhouse, and which she regarded with the particular pride of a person who has made something out of nothing. Holt Deegan left Millhaven in the winter of 1883. His ranch had finally failed, which Grant heard about from Sheriff Teller, and Deegan had sold the property for what he could get and moved on, presumably to some other territory where he could begin his particular cycle of grievance and mismanagement again. Grant told Nora about it over supper, and she said, "I hope he finds some peace," which was more generous than Grant managed, though he kept that thought to himself. The Lockhart Ranch continued to prosper through the following years in the way that well-managed land and hard, honest work produce prosperity, steadily rather than dramatically, the cattle numbers growing and the grazing land maintained, and a second barn added in 1885 to accommodate the horses Grant had begun breeding in addition to the cattle operation. Samuel Torres stayed on and became the foreman when the third ranch hand was hired, which position he filled with a quiet, capable authority that Grant trusted completely. Nora and Grant's life together deepened in the way that is impossible to describe in large gestures, because it happens in small ones, in the accumulation of mornings and evenings and seasons and disagreements resolved and understandings reached, and the 1,000 daily choices to be present to each other fully rather than partially. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions and the comfort to express them, but they argued in the way of people who are fundamentally on the same side, and they had established early enough that honesty was the foundation of everything they were building, that neither of them was tempted to win an argument through misdirection or concealment. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, and from a toddler into a child of 3, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of looking at the world with careful assessment before he engaged with it. He followed Grant around the ranch yard with the devoted concentration of a small person learning how things work, asking questions with a frequency that Grant answered with the same patience Nora brought to the schoolhouse, because he had learned from watching her that answering a child's questions seriously rather than brushing them aside was how you built a person who thought well. "He's going to be a rancher," Grant said one evening, watching Thomas through the window as the boy examined the wheel of the wagon with intense focus. "He's going to be whatever he decides to be," Nora said, "but it would be good if he understood the ranch first." "Agreed," Grant said. "Both of us should understand the things we came from before we decide where we're going." She looked at him with that look she had, the one that was full of more than it showed on the surface, and said, "That is an unexpectedly philosophical thing to say." "I have my moments," he said. In the fall of 1886, Nora told him she was expecting again. He had learned by then how she delivered important news, always in the morning, always plainly, always while doing something else, so that there was something to occupy the hands while the words did their work. She was at the stove again, and she said it, and he crossed the kitchen again and stood in front of her and put his hands on her face, which was what he always did, and she smiled up at him in the way that she had learned to smile at him over 4 years, openly and without the careful measurement of the early days. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings again, but otherwise extremely well." He kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, and she put her hands over his hands and held them there. And it was the same as the first time and entirely different from the first time. Better in the way that everything between them was better now for being fully known. Their daughter arrived in June of 1887, which was the same month in which Thomas had arrived 4 years earlier, and Grant thought afterward that this family had a preference for June that was probably nothing more than coincidence but felt like a pattern. She was born on an evening rather than a morning, and Grant sat in the main room with Thomas asleep on the settle beside him, because the boy was 4 and not to be sent away but also not to be in the middle of things, and he read to Thomas until the boy fell asleep and then sat in the quiet and waited. Helen Torres, who was by now a reliable presence at important moments, came out and told him he had a daughter. He looked at Thomas, asleep beside him, and then at Helen, and he said, "And Nora." "Strong as ever," Helen said. "Go on." He carried Thomas, who did not wake, into his small bedroom and put him carefully in his bed and tucked him in, and then went to the main bedroom and found Nora, tired and clear-eyed as before, with a small girl in her arms who was regarding the world with the same intense seriousness that Thomas had displayed as a newborn. "She looks like she's already making decisions," Grant said, sitting beside them on the edge of the bed. "Good," Nora said. "She'll need to out here. What do we call her?" Nora looked at the baby and then at him, and she said, "I thought Margaret, my mother's name." "Margaret Lockhart," he said, and that too settled into the room and felt right. Margaret was a different kind of child than Thomas, quicker to laugh, faster to movement, less patient with examination and more interested in action. She walked early and talked early and had a temper that appeared in brief, bright flashes and dissolved just as quickly, which was a characteristic that Nora observed with a slightly complicated expression that Grant recognized as a person recognizing something of themselves. Thomas, who had been 4 when she arrived, regarded his sister with the slightly baffled affection of a careful person learning to exist beside someone who is not careful. And it made Grant think about himself and Nora in those first months, and how much they had both learned from the particular education of accepting a person different from yourself. The territory itself was changing in those years as well, changing in the ways that all territories changed in the 1880s, with more settlers arriving and more towns establishing themselves, and the great ranches of the cattle barons like John Chisholm slowly giving way to a landscape of smaller family operations. The railroad had reached the Basin region in 1885, which shortened the drive to Millhaven from 11 miles of wagon track to 11 miles of somewhat better wagon track, but more importantly made goods available that had previously required a long journey or a long wait. Grant had a real parlor stove installed in the main room in 1886, a beautiful cast iron thing with decorative panels, and Nora had looked at it with the expression of a person receiving something they had not known they wanted until they had it. The school had grown to 22 students by 1887 and had outgrown the Macy building. Nora had begun writing to Santa Fe again with her characteristic organized persistence, and the result of this campaign was a county decision to fund the construction of a proper schoolhouse in Millhaven, which would serve the wider basin and require a second teacher. Nora was appointed the head teacher, and she recruited the second teacher herself, a young woman named Addie Marsh, who was, by one of those coincidences that the West was prone to producing, the younger sister of Clara Marsh, Grant's former fiancée. Nora told Grant about this appointment over supper and watched his face carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is she a good teacher?" "She seems to be," Nora said. "I saw her work with a group of children in Millhaven last week. She's patient and smart, and she wants to be here." "Then she should be here," Grant said. "Her sister and I parted ways 5 years before I ever met you, and even if we hadn't, that's nothing to do with Addie Marsh." Nora nodded. She had known he would say something like this, but she had needed to hear it said plainly. "You were going to tell me regardless of what I said," he pointed out. "Yes," she agreed. But it's better that you said the right thing." He looked at her with that expression she had always been partial to, the one that was quiet amusement and genuine affection in equal parts. "You always give me the chance to say the right thing before you do the right thing without me," he said. "That seems fair," she said. The new school opened in Millhaven in September of 1888, a proper frame building on the north side of Main Street with 2 rooms and a small office for Nora, and a real brass bell above the door that Thomas, who was 5 and had started his own schooling that year, declared was the best bell he had ever heard. Nora rang it on the first morning, with Thomas watching from the front row with wide eyes, and Margaret, who was 1.5 and being held by Grant at the back of the room for the inaugural ceremony, watching her mother with the particular focused intensity that she brought to everything her mother did. Grant watched Nora ring the bell and look out at the children assembled in front of the new school, and saw on her face something he had not seen on the stage depot porch 6 years ago, something that had not been there yet, a completeness, a full and settled knowledge of her own place in the world and her own worth in it. And he thought that this was what it looked like when a person became entirely themselves, and that he had been present for some portion of the building of it, and that this was one of the things he was most proud of in his life. He did not say this to her at the time, because she was busy being the head teacher of the new Cimarron Basin School, and Thomas was trying to get his attention to ask about the bell mechanism, and Margaret was making a bid for freedom over his left arm. He said it to her that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, sitting on the porch in the September night with the stars doing their usual extravagance overhead. She listened to him say it with her hands around a cup of tea, looking at the stars. When he had finished, she was quiet for a while. "I could not have done it without the salary," she said, "and I could not have had the salary without the school, and I could not have had the school without you going to the county land office and paying $3 for the use of the Macy building." "That was a practical matter," he said. "So you said at the time," she said. "I know better now." He looked at the stars. "We built it," he said, "both of us, that's how it works." She leaned against him, which she did now the way she breathed, naturally and without thinking about it, and he put his arm around her, which was the same. They sat on the porch in the September night for a long time, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the territory was enormous and dark and beautiful in every direction, and Millhaven was 11 miles away with its school, and its justice of the peace and its restaurant where they had eaten apple pie on their wedding day. And all of it was theirs in the way that things are yours not because you own them, but because you have shaped them and been shaped by them. The years from 1888 forward were years of settled abundance. Not the kind of abundance that means excess, but the kind that means nothing is lacking, where the life you have built is sufficient to the life you wanted, and the people in it are the people you would choose above all other people if you were given the full catalog of the world to choose from. Thomas started school and proved to be an excellent student, which Nora considered an unremarkable outcome given the circumstances, and Grant considered evidence of specific character, and they argued about this cheerfully for years. He had Grant's steadiness and Nora's curiosity, and was, by the age of 8, already something of a reader, which made Nora so happy that Grant sometimes caught her watching Thomas read, with an expression that was very close to the one she wore when she looked at the mountains in the evening light. Margaret, who turned 2 and then 3, and then 4 with the same forward-charging energy she had brought to everything since birth, had decided that the ranch horses were her particular domain, a position that Grant supported on the grounds that she had genuine instinct for it, and Nora supported with a slight nervousness that she managed by making sure Margaret was always supervised near the large animals. By 5 she could sit a horse that was led by the bridle, and by 6 she was riding in the paddock under Grant's watchful eye with a confidence that made him think of his father's father, who had reportedly felt the same way about horses, and had communicated it to his descendants without any of them quite knowing how. They had one more child, a second son born in the spring of 1891, who they named Daniel, after Grant's father, which was a name Grant had been holding in reserve for the right moment, and which Nora received with the particular warmth of a woman who understands what it means when a private man offers up something of his own history. Daniel was from the beginning a sociable and generous-natured child, easiest in temperament of the three, happiest when there were other people around him. He was Thomas's opposite in this way, Thomas being someone who could be content alone, and Margaret's opposite in the sense that where she charged the world Daniel preferred to charm it, and the three of them together were a family in miniature that was endlessly interesting to both their parents. Grant's ranch continued to be a working success. The horse breeding operation grew to become its own separate source of income, and by 1892, Grant was selling horses to ranchers across a wide area of the territory, horses that had a reputation for soundness and good temperament that reflected the care that went into their raising. Samuel Torres, who had become foreman and had also, in the natural course of things, married a woman from a family in the next basin south and had 2 children of his own, was the kind of partner in the ranch's work that Grant had not expected to find and was profoundly grateful for. And he said so regularly, because he had learned from Nora that the failure to say important things was its own kind of dishonesty. In the late summer of 1892, a decade after Nora had stepped off the stage in Millhaven, something happened that they both later described as the moment they understood what they had built, not because it was dramatic in itself, but because of what it showed them. There was a fire at the Calloway homestead, 8 miles northeast, the property of Pete Calloway, who had stood outside the schoolhouse on opening day and told Grant that a good woman was a different kind of good land. The fire started in the barn on a dry August evening and moved to the house before it could be stopped, and the Calloway family lost most of their possessions and the barn entirely, though no lives were lost. The news came to the Lockhart ranch at dawn the next morning, brought by the Calloway's oldest boy riding hard, and within 2 hours Grant had organized the Lockhart hands and the Torres family, and driven to the Calloway place with a wagon loaded with lumber and supplies. Nora had gone ahead on horseback with Helen Torres, carrying food and blankets, and the particular organizational energy that she brought to any situation that required it. By the time Grant arrived with the wagon, Nora had already assessed the situation, determined what was needed most urgently, and begun directing the Calloway women and children in the sorting and salvaging of what remained. She had also somehow, in the space of 2 hours, sent word to 3 other families in the basin, and by mid-morning there were 11 people on the Calloway property, and by afternoon there were 17, and they worked through the full day in the August heat without anyone having organized them into an official effort, simply because the need was clear, and the people of the basin had learned over the years that they were bound to each other in ways that the geography tried to deny. Grant worked beside Pete Calloway all day, and at one point in the late afternoon they stopped and drank water from a bucket and looked at what 17 people had accomplished in a day, which was a good deal, and Calloway said, "I remember when you brought her to town on the stage. 10 years ago last April," Grant said. "I told you a good woman was a different kind of good land," Calloway said. "You did." "I was right," Calloway said, "but I undersold it. It's not just different. It's better." Grant looked across the yard to where Nora was helping the Calloway children stack the salvaged goods under a tarp she had rigged from wagon canvas, directing them with patient authority, and she looked up at that moment and found him across the distance, and did what she always did when she found him across a distance, which was simply to hold his gaze for a moment in that particular way that meant everything without meaning anything specific. He thought about the letter she had written, and the letter he had written back, and the 3 hard truths he had told her before they ever shook hands. He thought about the stage depot, and the chimney and the bedroom window, and the kitchen floor, and the school in the Macy building, and the night on the porch when he had told her he was in love with her, and she had told him she had known it for 4 months. He thought about Thomas reading by the firelight and Margaret on horseback in the paddock, and Daniel, who was only one and already smiling at everything the world put in front of him. He thought that honesty had been the right foundation, not because it made everything easy, but because it made everything real, and real things lasted in a way that comfortable fictions never could, and the life built on that foundation was the most substantial thing he had ever put his hands to. He raised his cup of water at her across the yard, a small gesture, the kind that carries everything. She smiled and turned back to the children. The Calloway family rebuilt over the following month, with the continued help of the Basin community, and the new barn was larger than the old one. And the house, when it was done, had a proper parlor and a kitchen floor of fitted boards, because Grant had overseen the laying of them personally and had asked Pete Calloway's wife, a woman named Vera, what she had always wanted and had never had in the previous house, and had built it in. When the new house was finished and the Calloway family had moved back in, Vera Calloway sent Nora a small gift, a book of pressed flowers, which was not an extravagant thing but was a significant one, because pressed flowers were not something people had in abundance in the territory in 1892, and the book had clearly been kept carefully for years before it was given away. Nora put it on the shelf in the main room, and Grant saw her look at it sometimes, this quiet thing on the shelf, and understood that it meant something to her that was about more than flowers. They were sitting on the porch one October evening in 1892, the three children in bed, the night cool and clear and full of stars, and Nora said quite suddenly, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" "About the chimney," he said. "About the chimney," she said. "Before you had even said good evening or introduced yourself properly, you told me the chimney still drew badly." "I know," he said. "I did not plan to lead with that." "I know you didn't," she said. "That's why I knew." Knew what? She looked at him in the starlight, this woman he had built 10 years with, who had shaped the school and this ranch and 3 children and the Basin community in ways that were still spreading outward from the original center of her, and who was looking at him now with that expression she had that showed everything underneath it. "That you were the person in the letter," she said. "That you were exactly who you had told me you were. Because someone who is trying to impress you doesn't lead with the thing that's broken. Someone who is trying to be honest with you does." He thought about that. He thought about the stage depot and his hat in his hands and the way his mouth had found the chimney before anything more strategic could intervene. "You wrote that you wanted honesty above all things," he said. "I did. I took you at your word." "You did," she said, "and I have thanked God for it every day since." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat in the October night looking at the stars, and the ranch was quiet and the land was wide and the life they had built was all around them, solid and real in every direction, and there was nothing left undone between them, no truth held back, no important thing unsaid. Thomas came and went through his school years and grew into a young man with his mother's love of books and his father's feeling for the land. And at 18, he told his parents he intended to study law in Santa Fe, which was in keeping with a territory that was changing fast and would need people who understood it. And both his parents told him this was the right thing if it was what he wanted, and it was what he wanted, and he went. Margaret, at 16, was already the best rider in the Basin, by common agreement, and she had a gift for the horses that was beyond training, something she had been born with, and she worked beside Grant in the horse breeding operation with a partnership that was the particular pride of his later ranching years, the feeling of a man who sees what he has spent his life building pass into capable hands that are also his own blood. Daniel grew into the sociable, generous person he had always suggested he was going to be, and at 20 took over the management of the cattle side of the operation in partnership with Samuel Torr's son, Mateo, who had grown up on the ranch and knew it as well as anyone. And the partnership between the Torr's family and the Lockhart family continued into the next generation in a way that Grant reflected on with specific satisfaction, because it was an example of what fair treatment and honest dealing produced over time. Nora taught at the Cimarron Basin School for 22 years, until 1904, when she finally stepped back to allow the next generation of teachers she had trained to carry it forward. By then, the school had grown to 40 students and 3 teachers, and had a reputation across the territory. When she retired from teaching, there was a ceremony in Millhaven that most of the town attended, and people came from as far as Santa Fe who had heard about the school and about the woman who had built it from an abandoned homestead and a letter to the county board. Grant sat in the front row at that ceremony and watched the speeches and the presentations, and watched Nora receive all of it with the gracious efficiency with which she received everything. And he thought about a woman who had stepped off a stage on an April morning in 1882 and looked at a strange town with the eyes of a person who was measuring rather than despairing, and how far that woman had traveled from that morning, not in miles, but in the depth of life she had filled the years with. She sat down beside him after the speeches were done, while the room was still full of conversation, and he took her hand and she leaned against him and said, "I am very tired." "I know," he said. "We can go home whenever you want." She looked around the room at the people who had come, the families from the basin and the teachers she had trained and the students now grown who had come back to be there, and she said, "A few more minutes." "As many as you need," he said. "I wrote that letter," she said, very quietly, not looking at him but looking at the room, "because I had nothing left to lose by being honest about what I wanted. I had been disappointed twice. I was 26 years old and teaching school alone in Kansas, and my father was dead, and I had nothing to build from except honesty." "You built rather a lot from it," he said. "We did," she said, "both of us." He held her hand a little tighter. She turned and looked at him, and she was 50 years old now, and her hair had silver in it, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes that were the record of 22 years of reading to children in available light. And she was looking at him with the same direct, open expression she had used on the stage depot porch in 1882. And he thought that she was more beautiful now than she had been then, not in spite of the years, but because of them. Because beauty of that kind is made of everything that goes into a person, every choice and every truth spoken and every year lived fully. "3 hard truths," she said, "before we even shook hands. Do you remember?" "I remember," he said. "The house was rough," she said. "It was. And there was Deegan." "There was, and Clara Marsh." "Yes," she smiled. "And I came anyway," she said. "You came anyway," he agreed. "Because the truths were the point," she said, "not the things they were about. Anyone can tell you good things about themselves. The truths were the point. They told me what kind of man you were going to be." He looked at her and thought about all of it. Everything from the letter with the Kansas postmark to this room in Millhaven, with the town that had grown up around the life they had built in it. And he said, "Were you right?" She put her head on his shoulder in the way she had always done, in the wagon and on the porch and in every ordinary moment of their life together. "Yes," she said, "I was entirely right." They stayed for another half-hour, and then he drove her home. Not in a wagon now, but in a good solid buggy with a proper seat and a canopy against the afternoon sun. 11 miles of road that was better than it had been in 1882, but was still the same road, the same sage and space and the mountains to the west, and the sky that was, as Nora had said 22 years ago, more like the inside of a shell than ordinary blue. The Lockhart Ranch house was not the house it had been in 1882. There were 4 rooms now, and proper windows in every one, and a kitchen floor of fitted boards, and a chimney that had drawn perfectly for 30 years, and a porch that ran along 3 sides of the house rather than one. And the barn was large and well kept, and the paddocks along the south side were full of horses that were by now known across 3 territories for their soundness and their temperament. Grant stopped the buggy in the yard and helped her down, which she let him do not because she needed the help, but because it was the kind of small courtesy that had survived everything, and neither of them saw any reason to retire it. And they stood together in the yard in the October afternoon light. the same quality of light that had been present the evening he had told her he loved her, golden and long slanting, and with the smell of sage underneath everything. Margaret was in the far paddock with a young mare, her voice carrying clear across the yard in a low, steady cadence that was how she spoke to the horses, and Daniel was somewhere in the cattle side of things beyond the barn, and Thomas was in Santa Fe at his law office, but he had written last week and was planning to visit for Christmas with his wife, a young woman named Caroline who was from a Taos family and who Nora had approved of immediately, and Grant was learning to know. "Good day," Grant said, standing beside her in the yard. "Very good day," she agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and they stood together in the October afternoon looking at everything they had made, the ranch and the land and the life that had grown from a letter and 3 hard truths, and a handshake on the porch of a stage depot in April of 1882. And it was sufficient, and it was solid, and it was theirs in the deepest sense of that word. Shaped by their hands and their choices and their honesty with each other through every season and every difficulty and every ordinary evening on the porch. Margaret looked up from the paddock and raised her hand at them across the yard, and they raised their hands back. A hawk circled overhead in the wide blue shell of the sky, and the horses moved in the paddock with the unhurried ease of animals that were well cared for and knew it, and the mountains to the west were beginning their evening transformation, and everything was present and accounted for and deeply, permanently good. "Come inside," Nora said. "I'll put the kettle on." He walked with her through the door of the house they had built together, and the door closed behind them, and the October light lay across the yard and the mountains and the enormous western sky, and the ranch was quiet and full and complete.